On the shores of a deep and sheltered cove on an island in Georgian Bay lie the remains of one of Ontario's most extensive ghost towns, Depot Harbour. Built in the 1890s by Canada's lumber king, John Rudolphus Booth, Depot Harbour had the brightest future of any town in Canada.
J.R. Booth wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He and his family emigrated from Ireland, were caught up in a cholera epidemic, survived the crossing, survived the epidemic, and eventually he became one of the richest men in Canada. Early on in his life, he went to Vermont and worked for several years actually on the Vermont Central Railway. And with that experience, he came back to Canada and brought his family to Bytown, the origins of Ottawa. And the story goes with $9 in his pocket, started a mill.
4 years later, in 1858, Ottawa became the capital of Canada. When tenders were called for the construction of the Parliament buildings, 31-year-old Booth stunned the established lumber barons by winning the contracts to supply the lumber.
He was able to underbid everybody else by basically using cheap labor. There were a number of unemployed longshoremen in Quebec City and Montreal, and using those men, he was able to undercut the prices of all of the other lumbermen in Ottawa.
With the contract sewn up, Booth needed lumber. In 1867, he bid on the timber limits in what is today's Algonquin Park. Successful, this laid the foundation for his vast lumber empire that at its peak spanned 18,000 square kilometers of timber limits. This was the equivalent of a 1.5-kilometer wide strip of trees stretching across Canada.
And this swing bridge opens up a certain time of day, so the boaters know in advance when it's open. This used to be a railroad track right through.
Once Booth acquired the timber rights in Algonquin Park, the next step was to move the logs from Algonquin to Ottawa. Booth looked at a number of little fledgling railroads that had been started and pieced them all together. Booth was really a visionary, and Georgian Bay, being on the Great Lakes, was access to anywhere else in the world.
If Booth extended his rail line to Georgian Bay, he could then offer grain growers in the west the shortest route to the Atlantic ports and capture the lucrative grain trade. Booth found a small rail line for sale on Georgian Bay.
The Parry Sound Colonization Railway had gone bankrupt, and Booth purchased it and made inquiries about purchasing dock space for his rail terminus. Right away, people saw dollar signs and asked for too much money.
So Booth kept searching. A few kilometers away, across the channel on Parry Island, Booth discovered a flat shoreline big enough for a town with the deepest and best protected waters on all of Georgian Bay.
This is the main channel coming into Depot Harbour, and the water in this area here is very deep, 50 or 60 feet of water. You would have a half a dozen ships parked out down in the bottom of this bay, waiting to be serviced into the freight sheds and the elevators. As a kid, we used to come out here and swim, watching the ships going down through the channel.
Booth shattered the dreams of Parry Sound residents when he chose to terminate his rail line on the Ojibwe Indian Reserve on Parry Island.
Booth wasn't a savior because the people were self-sustaining people. They had livestock and they had farms, and so it wasn't really as if the savior was coming.
Booth paid the reluctant Ojibways $9 an acre for the 300 acres town site, and as part of the deal, promised to build a fence on both sides of the track.
The reason why the native people asked for the fence was because back in those days there was a lot of livestock on the reserve. People had cows and they had horses, and also to keep the kids away from the tracks too.
Construction began in the harbor on a massive grain elevator. In town, boarding houses, family dwellings, and a hotel were erected on 12 new streets. And to service the engines of his railway, Booth added a massive roundhouse.
He suddenly realized he needed more land, so he went back to the native people again, and they said, I need more land. And they just said a flat no. He said, because you didn't live up to your word.
When the Ojibways of Parry Island refused Booth's request for more land because he hadn't put up the promised fence, Booth used a little-known provision in the Railway Act governing native land to get what he wanted.
He came back and expropriated the land. And of course, the band chief and council were pretty put out about that.
You have to look at Booth through the eyes of the time. He did expropriate land from the Ojibwe. He promised them things that he didn't deliver, but at the same time, he treated his employees really well. Booth cut the average working day, but he didn't cut the corresponding pay. And other mills saw what he was doing and followed suit. And the Grand Trunk Railroad strike put 2,000 of Booth's men out of work. In a typical act of generosity, though, he paid the men for their 7 days lost time.
Yeah, eventually he put the fence up, because I can remember when I was a kid, I could see it along sections of the track.
With the final tract of land secured, Booth constructed a swing bridge to connect Depot Harbor on Parry Island to the mainland.
Behind me, the railroad tracks used to go into Depot Harbor. This was a swing bridge, a railroad swing bridge. At the time, there was no foot traffic on it. We weren't allowed to walk across it, but we did anyway, because this was the only way into white man's land in Parry Sound.
On December 5, 1896, the first train puffed across the swing bridge. Lumber King John Booth now ruled the largest private railway empire in Canada, and Depot Harbor had the advantage of being the shortest route to the Atlantic ports for Western grain growers. Depot Harbor, in the heart of Anglo-Saxon Ontario, was divided by race and class.
The upper half of the town were mostly Anglo-Saxons, and the lower half of the town were the foreign people. Now, the foreign people had their own way of life. They made their own wine, they made their own beer, they made their own sausages. That's the way the Europeans lived in the old country, and they transported that into Depot Harbor. But the upper half of the town didn't have the same way of life. We did get along because we all went to the same schools and we all went to pretty much the same churches. And whenever we had festivals, and it usually was on the Catholic Church lawn because the property was so well laid out, but everyone participated. These are the ruins of the Sacred Heart Catholic Church of Depot Harbor, built in 1905.
It was like a United Nations up in Depot Harbor, and people all got along well because, nobody had any money. So they just scraped with what they had, and they all scraped together, so it drew the community together. That was the way with the native people, too. So everybody just barely got along, and I think this is what drew the island together. It was one big family, I thought, which is good.
We felt no different to the natives than the Italians or the French or the Yugoslavs or the Anglos. We went to school together, we played together, we fished together, we hunted together, we did a lot of things together.
Parry Island. Back in those days, it's so different. The store owners mixed with the native community so much that the store owners could speak a bit of native language. It's unheard of these days. I remember Joe's dad. I remember when he used to walk into the store, he would say, "Opta." And what he wanted to say was, "Opta Kadem Jimnido," which means half black devil. But he didn't want to say the whole thing, so he would just say, "Opta," and then he'd start laughing.
By 1900, the massive grain elevator was handling more than 38% of all Canada's grain shipments, and Depot Harbour had become one of the busiest ports on Georgian Bay.
This is a dock that was built by J.R. Booth. It was the elevator dock, and it accommodated the ships that were being unloaded into the elevator, and then from the elevator into the boxcars, approximately 120 car loads a day. As a kid, we used to come down and fish off one of the docks, and you would get a 6-quart basket, 11-quart basket of fish in a matter of a half an hour.
So around 1900, it was really the peak of railroad building in Canada, and particularly in this area. Booth's line had attracted a lot of attention, and he was starting to field offers from just about everybody. CP, CN, and Grand Trunk Railroad all wanted to connect to his lines. It was still the shortest route and the most lucrative way to move goods.
In 1904, 80-year-old Booth sold his line to the Grand Trunk Railway for $16 million and started a new career in pulp and paper.
Depot Harbour really boomed from early 1900 to the end of the 1920s. Millions of tons of goods were coming in and out. Everything from lumber, iron ore, wool, silks, spices, a little bit of everything. It was a major port and pretty bustling. The town at its peak saw, I think there were something like 3,000 residents in the town, which was actually a bit bigger than Parry Sound at the time.
That's where the wharf used to be for the ferry scow, which ran across the channel to the opposite side to that sandy beach, and that's where the other pier used to be. And this was the only connection to Depot Harbour at one point.
You would have to stand on the shore and holler as loud as you can so they could hear you. And then if they're sober enough, they would come and get you. And that was a dreadful thought, crossing that ferry. Now, we did have a hotel, but it didn't sell liquor or beer because hotels were not licensed to sell liquor or beer. And if you wanted to buy it from a bootlegger, then you had to take your chances that you were caught on the premises on a police raid. Well, when the police put their car on the ferry, they had to travel 4 miles. And a lot of news traveled in 4 miles. So the fellow at the ferry would call the bootleggers and tell them that the OPP are on their way. And then everybody else would be notified.
Of course there was bootleggers, because at that time, Native people couldn't buy liquor. They couldn't get into hotels to drink beer. They could go away and die for Canada, but they couldn't drink beer in the hotels.
By 1920, the Grand Trunk Railway was broke. No longer benefiting from moving Booth's lumber and incurring greater costs transporting grain, the line was absorbed into the newly created Canadian National Railway, a government railway established to take over bankrupt lines.
My father came to Parry Sound in 1916 and moved to Depot Harbour in 1923. My father was also a shoemaker by trade. He was also very handy with carpentry work. And the railroad would call upon him when they would ship grain out of Depot Harbour, and my father would have to board up and seal the doorways with lumber and paper to keep the grain from leaking out as it's being in transportation to other destinations.
CN, the new railway giant, found many of its lines and services redundant. Depot Harbour's roundhouse and locomotive shop were closed in favor of their yards south of Parry Sound. Although longtime staff were laid off, trains continued going to Depot Harbour.
This is the roundhouse that was built back in 1895, accommodated about 15 to 20 engines. They turned them around in the round table, which is out the back here, and then they would be serviced and headed back out to Ottawa. It's over 100 years old, and it is now more or less like Roman ruins.
On December 8, 1925, Depot Harbour's creator, John Rudolphus Booth, died. Mackenzie King eulogized this humble carpenter as one of the founding fathers of Canada. Ottawa's Daily Citizen wrote, "The late John Booth was always a plain man and a worker, an absolute democrat, who asked his workmen to do nothing he would not do himself." A fierce winter storm in 1933 had a far greater impact on Depot Harbour than anyone could have imagined. In 1933, CN sounded the death knell for Depot Harbour when it refused to repair the damaged Cashew River's trestle.
During the Great Depression, the government had a make-work project to start construction of what became Highway 60. When CN looked at their damaged trestle and went back to the government for funds to repair it, the government decided not to put money into the rail line since they were already putting money into the highway, and CN decided to abandon it. The bridge not being fixed meant that no trains were coming to Depot Harbour, and that was really the end.
Severing this lifeline destroyed the singular advantage that enabled Depot Harbour to become one of the busiest Great Lake ports and effectively condemned the town to death. But Depot Harbour would not go out with a whimper.
VE Day was the end of the Second World War, and that evening my mother rapped on the door and said, "I think you better get out of the bath because I think the world's coming to an end." And I think most people were very upset with what happened in Japan when the atom bomb was dropped. Most people had the feeling here that maybe it was going to happen to us. I kind of suspected things like that myself until I got further down the street and then realized it was the grain elevator which was on fire, and it was just out of this world. That night there was a north wind blowing, which it blew across to number 2 freight shed. Number 2 freight shed was full of cordite. These cordite boxes would go 200 feet in the air and explode. It's something that I will never forget, and I'm sure any of us that were there will never forget.
What we're looking at now was the ruins of number 2 freight shed. And when this blew up from the fire of the elevator, it lit up for about 10-mile radius of Parry Sound. Number 1 freight shed was loaded with cotton bales, shipped in from the south, and it was being stored here. And the night of the fire, both freight sheds burnt, but the one with the cordite was the big explosion. There's literally thousands of pilings in this whole area.
The end of the war was the end of the line for Depot Harbour. CN began auctioning off the houses.
You don't like to see a good thing end. I felt kind of sad. I felt sad for the people. Depot Harbour wasn't there anymore. I mean, the town was there, but you know, the grain elevator and the sheds and that, they were all gone. And it just seemed that there was nothing left for the people. After Depot Harbour died, there wasn't much change in the native village. There really wasn't much change. Some people moved to Toronto to work, and some come back home to die.
Sections of Booth's once glorious line were lifted, bit by bit, until the route vanished completely, along with the town of Depot Harbour.
This is the foundation where our family home was from 1935 on. I just happened to discover it now. simply because it was overgrown with trees and shrubs. Oh, there was always a bit of nostalgia when you lived in Depot Harbour, as I did. For us children, we were in a community that was, it was a closed community. It was a community that had compassion. Everybody cared for you. Depot Harbour was a great place to be at that time. As kids, it was the only sidewalk in town. And it might be about 500 or 600 feet long. We used to enjoy riding a bicycle on this sidewalk that went up to the shopping mall. And because the rest of the town, it was just gravel roads.
It's a beautiful life. Life is what we make it. Heaven isn't up there. It's not down there either. It's right here. You can make it a beautiful day, or you can make it a hard day. Whatever you like, we're given a choice. Everything that happens in my Creator's world, there's a reason for it. Life is beautiful.
Nature is slowly reclaiming the crumbling railway roundhouse that guards the road access to Depot Harbour, once Ontario's most promising Great Lake port. Today, one of Canada's most extensive ghost towns.
Dragging your heels is dragging you down, but down through the valley and over the hills to the ghost town.